So for this time period, the Industrial Revolution, this is the kind of largest topic, the bit that's got the most information that you would need to know. This period, also often just called the 18th and the 19th centuries, covers the period between 1700 and 1900. This is the period where England went from being mostly rural to mainly people living in towns and cities, working in factories. It's also the time there was a huge population increase from 10 to 40 million. This obviously led to crime increase. More people, more crimes. And it led to more competition for food, competition for jobs, competition for housing. And also in cities, more crime happened. There's more opportunities for crime because of the nature of towns and cities. You can easily hide, you don't know people. So more crime took place in cities, everything from theft up to violence and murder. This is also a time when the government start to fear the poor even more. This links partly to the French Revolution in 1789, when the kind of lower classes in France rose up and took over the country, killing the king. The government in England did not want the same thing to happen. They did not want the lower classes to gain power. So what we also see in this period is a kind of attempt to squash down the poor. It is a time of more scientific understanding and logical thought, and therefore witchcraft was decriminalized because they no longer believed that witchcraft was a real thing. They start to believe more in science rather than in superstitious beliefs like witchcraft. We also see a big change because this is the period where first prisons are actually used as a punishment. Pre-1700s, we only used prisons or jails, as they were called, to hold prisoners before their trial. They were a holding place, or you could get locked up for debt. But other than that, prisons were not used as a punishment, but they are from this time period. Now, there's various crimes that increase at this time. One of those is highway robbery. This is mainly because more people start to move around. As the Industrial Revolution progresses, more and more traders and merchants travel around the country buying and selling and carrying lots of goods, but also large amounts of money. Therefore, highway robbery becomes a increased crime. Generally, highway robbers were ex-soldiers who had been let go from the army due to the end of a war. They would ride on horses, they would carry guns. Both of those things became cheaper and more readily available in this period. They would target the merchants on the road, steal their money. This massively increased because, as I say, people carrying large amounts of money around, the roads weren't very good, there was no police force, so highway robbery went up. However, we also say then the decline of highway robbery by the late 1700s, mainly because it becomes a capital crime, so you would get executed if you were caught doing it. Road quality improved, so the coaches, the merchants, the traders were able to get away faster from the highway robbers. They also started to use banks, so they weren't carrying around large amounts of money. So by the end of the 1700s, highway robbery has then gone down again. We have poaching, which had always been a problem since it had been made a crime under William the Conqueror. So it had been a crime to poach, hunt animals in forests since 1066. But the difference is in this period, it becomes a capital crime. So that's the Black Act. So you would be sentenced to death for poaching. So if you were hunting deer or rabbits or hare on someone else's land. Now, that's obviously very harsh because most people who poached did so because they were poor and they were just trying to get some food. However, there was gangs who poached, you know, and you know, would hunt hundreds of deer and sell them for great profit. But generally, it was poor people who did it. Poaching was still seen as a social crime. So even though it was against the law and it was actually a capital crime, lots of people carried on doing it because they thought that it shouldn't be a crime to hunt animals. And also, people wouldn't report others for doing it. They wouldn't turn them in. So often it was easy to get away with. But if you were caught, then you would be sentenced to death. Smuggling was another social crime and increased at this time. People would smuggle goods in so they didn't have to pay tax on them. So we're thinking things like tea, alcohol like brandy and wine, tobacco, things like that would be smuggled into the country on boats and then collected on beaches and then taken to towns and cities to sell. There was huge gangs involved in smuggling, for example, the Hawkhurst gang, thousands and thousands. There was at least 20,000 people involved in smuggling. And it was very, very hard to stop because of the amount of beaches in England. There wasn't that many customs officials. The smugglers carried guns, but mainly because people, you know, wouldn't report it because it was because they were able to buy cheap goods. Because the whole point of smuggling was to make the goods cheaper because they didn't have to pay taxes on them. So highway robbery, poaching, smuggling are all crimes that you could talk about for this Industrial Revolution period. In terms of punishments, for the first 100 years, so for the 1700s, this was dominated by the Bloody Code. The Bloody Code had been introduced in 1688, but it was expanded. So by 1810, 222 crimes were punishable by death. So basically any crime you committed, you could be sentenced to death for it. It was ridiculous, you know. The punishments no longer fit the crime because stealing a tiny thing like a loaf of bread would see you getting executed. So it really wasn't a just legal system. It also wasn't working because crime was increasing at this time rather than going down. And that was partly because juries wouldn't convict people because even if they knew they were guilty, they didn't think they deserved the death penalty, so they might find them innocent. So actually lots of guilty people were being just walking away free because the jury was not willing to sentence them to death. We also have other reasons why the Bloody Code declined. Often the role of Robert Peel. He was an MP, he was Home Secretary, he later became Prime Minister, and he argued that the Bloody Code just wasn't working. Crime was increasing, juries weren't convicting people, and he just said it was inhumane and it was wrong to execute people for small crimes. And therefore, as a result, the Bloody Code declined from the 1820s. They abolished a lot of the Bloody Code. And by the time that you get to 1841, the Bloody Code was over. And the death penalty still remained. The death penalty still existed, but only for very serious crimes like murder and treason. Also in the 1800s, they did get rid of public hangings because they said that they caused chaos. And it was inappropriate to execute people in public. It shouldn't be like, something to entertain a crowd. So they also started hanging people in private. And as I said, there would be a lot less people being executed because they would only execute for murder or treason. So the 1700 to 1900 period shows a big swing in this kind of change in attitude to punishments. The 1700s was all about the Bloody Code, but by the 1800s, the Bloody Code had declined and ended by 1841. But please don't get confused. They still had the death penalty for over another 100 years, but just for very serious crimes. One of the other things that comes about in this period is finally a police force. We have been talking about the fact that in medieval times and early modern times, there was no official paid police force. There was law enforcement and there was policing, such as the parish constables and the town watchmen, but none of those were really adequate. In the 1700s, we have two brothers, the Fielding brothers, who lived in London, who were magistrates, who start to begin what we later see as the early police force. The Fielding brothers set up the Bow Street Runners. These were a small group of paid employees who worked for the Fielding brothers, who investigated crimes and arrested people. The Fielding brothers also set up the horse patrols that worked to help catch the highway robbers. So it's another reason that highway robbery decreased, was the setting up of the horse patrols, and that was the Fielding brothers. They also set up a newspaper called the Hue and Cry, which had like kind of information about crime, information about people that they like wanted people as well. The Fielding brothers were important because, as I say, they set up this early police force, the Bow Street Runners, but they were so limited. There was only a small number of Bow Street Runners. It was not enough for the whole of London, because obviously it was only in London as well. Here we have again the role of Robert Peel. So this MP who was all about reform and wanted to change things, wanted to improve things. And he pushed Parliament to set up the Metropolitan Police through the Metropolitan Police Act in 1829. This, for the first time, created a police force, uniformed, trained, official paid police officers. They first started in London, but over the 1800s, they spread across the country, and by 1880s, there was over 200 forces across England. They also eventually set up the CID, so this is a special branch of the police just to investigate crime. So they're the detectives. It was called the detective branch to begin with, and then later renamed the CID. But Robert Peel was really key because he persuaded the government that, look, the crime is going up. We need a way to stop crime. And he proved that to them using statistics. So he proved to them that actually crime was on the increase. He proved to them that, you know, they needed a way to stop crime. He showed them the example of the Fielding brothers and the Bow Street Runners and how effective that was, and persuaded the government to expand that into a proper police force. Now, he also was able to do this because by this point, the government were taxing the people much more. Due to wars with Napoleon at the beginning of the 1800s, taxes had gone up. And those wars were over by this point, but they still had that tax money coming in. So they could use that on the police force. Now, part of the Whitechapel unit was looking at the police force, and obviously the problems with the police force and their failings in trying to catch Jack the Ripper. So everything that you know about the police force from the Jack the Ripper Whitechapel unit, such as they patrolled on the beat, they carried truncheons and whistles, they didn't use things like fingerprints. So all of that knowledge that you've got from the Whitechapel unit about the police, you can obviously bring in to this as well and talk about the fact that there was problems with the police force and they were unable to catch criminals like Jack the Ripper. The one thing you do need to be able to point out for this period is the role of the community declined significantly. They were no longer expected to catch criminals themselves. The hue and cry was over. Instead of going out looking for criminals themselves, they were expected to shout for a policeman, go and find a policeman, and the police would be the ones to catch the criminals. The role of the community still existed. For example, they had to give witness testimonies if they had witnessed a crime. And they were responsible for getting in touch with the police if they witnessed something as well. But generally, the role of the community declined because we have this paid police force. One of the big things that you will need to talk about for this time period is when they replaced the bloody code. So in the 1700s, it was mainly the bloody code that was being used as a punishment. So if you need to talk about punishments in the 1700s, you will be talking about the bloody code. But by the time we get to the 1800s, they had turned against the bloody code because it wasn't working. And as a result, they had to find some other punishments. And mainly this was, first of all, transportation, but then prisons. So transportation was used mainly in the 1820s and 30s. In the past, prisoners had been transported to America, but that had only been in small numbers and stopped after America became independent. Australia was then used in this time period. Over 150,000 criminals sent to Australia. So this was a big source of kind of punishment. They used this a lot. Prisoners were crowded onto ships. They then had to take the 4-month journey to Australia. About 1% people died on that journey because the conditions on those prison ships were horrendous. When they got to Australia, they were then used basically as slaves. They were forced to do farm work or building work, usually for 7 years. They were watched by soldiers. So soldiers were in charge of the criminals that were sent to Australia. And it was hideous. It was very, very hot, exhausting work in the sun. Obviously, there's snakes and poisonous spiders in Australia. It was pretty grim. However, after 7 years, you would get your ticket of leave. And that meant you could either come back to England or you could live out the rest of your life in Australia. And actually, the wages there were higher. At first, this was seen as a good punishment because it got rid of the criminals, sent them away. It reformed them through hard work. They couldn't reoffend in England because they weren't there. And the idea is if they did come back to England, they would be reformed. However, it didn't last long because it was so expensive. It cost £500,000 a year. And also the people in Australia, the free people, started to rebel against this and protest and demand that England stop sending criminals there. England were worried about losing Australia and Australia trying to become independent. So they gave in and stopped sending criminals there. Also, it just wasn't working because the crime rate continued to increase in England. One of the groups of people that you could talk about who were transported to Australia were the Tolpuddle Martyrs. They joined a secret trade union to demand higher wages. That was the role of their trade union, that's what it was going to try and do. Trade unions were not illegal, but the Tolpuddle Martyrs had made a secret oath. And the government used a law against sailors making secret oaths to punish the Tolpuddle Martyrs for what they'd done. This was completely wrong, but the government, as I've mentioned, were scared of the poor people, and they were convinced that if the trade unions, if these kind of groups for the rights of workers, if they were to become stronger, this might enable the poor to rise up against against the government, against the rich people. So they wanted to make an example of the Tolpuddle Martyrs and show to the other poor, if you try and stand up against the rich, this is what will happen to you. And they were transported to Australia. However, there was absolute public outrage. Thousands and thousands of people went on protest against this. And quite rightly, because they had been punished for being in a trade union, which was not against the law. Eventually, they were pardoned and were allowed to come home, but this took a few years. So they did spend a few years in Australia. The long-lasting kind of impact of the Tolpuddle Martyrs was that people were too scared to join trade unions because they were worried that they would be then punished. So the trade union movement was weakened for quite a long time, and workers for a long time were very scared to fight for their rights in case this happened to them. However, following the 20s and the 30s, actually transportation declined, as I've said, and the long-lasting punishment of prisons was brought in. There was prisons from the 1700s, and they were hideous. Before 1823, prisons were used But they were hideous. They were just, criminals were all thrown in together, men, women, mentally ill people, children. Lots of people died of jail fever. The food was not good. The conditions were awful. There was no sanitation. There was no fresh water, and you had to pay to get out. There was a lot of corruption, and there was also a lot of sexual assault, especially towards women. That was then changed by Robert Peel. So Robert Peel, as we've heard, introduced the police force, was responsible for ending the bloody code. He also said that prisons needed to be reformed. He says that, prisoners could not just be left to die of jail fever in prisons. He was influenced quite heavily by reformers like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry. Elizabeth Fry was a Quaker, and she did voluntary work in Newgate Prison in London, and she saw horrific things. Babies dying, and then women fighting over the dead baby to get the clothes for their own baby. She saw that, abuse of women by male prison guards. And she saw no attempts to help any of the prisoners. So what she did is she started bringing in religious education, but also teaching the women valuable skills like sewing. And she campaigned to the government to separate women and men, and for women to have female guards and for men to have male guards, and for religious instruction to be brought into all prisons. John Howard, who was a sheriff, he again campaigned for similar things. As the sheriff, he inspected prisons and he saw what was happening, and he saw the fact that jail fever was killing so many people. So he campaigned for the cleanliness and the sanitary conditions to be improved. Robert Peel listened to both of these people and also made his own decisions, and he introduced the Jails Act. This separated out the different prisoners, so men, women, children, mentally ill patients were separated. It ensured food and water, clean water, and proper sanitation, so that waste was being removed. This act massively reduced the deaths from jail fever, and it increased the safety of criminals. It also stopped the idea of schools for crime. Before, when all the criminals were together and you had very serious criminals in with minor criminals, the minor criminals would learn from the more serious criminals. But after the Jails Act, people were separated out, and you didn't have the same problem of it being schools for crime. The Jails Act also brought in religious education for all criminals to try and reform them. So the Jails Act really did aim at this idea of reform and making the criminals into better people. However, later on in the 1840s, people started to think that the Jails Act was too lenient, that it was too nice to be in prison, that criminals would go in there and have a nice, comfortable time. So they start to make things a bit more harsh again. The separate system and the silent system were later brought in. Under the separate system, criminals were kept separate from each other. They weren't allowed to socialise. They were kept in their cells 23 hours a day. When they went out to exercise, they were blindfolded. When they went to the chapel, they had to sit in separate boxes, so they couldn't talk to each other or see each other. This was not a good system, because it created a lot of mental illness and even suicide amongst the criminals. New prisons, huge new prisons were built to create this system, such as Pentonville, which is shown in the picture, where each criminal was in their own cell. The idea of this was reform, still through religious education, but also to deter criminals from committing crimes in the first place, because they wouldn't want to have to go and live in this really isolated prison system. They still kept the health benefits from the Jails Act, though, such as clean water. Later, this was made even more harsh, which was the silent system. The silent system didn't even bother to try and reform criminals. And this was because by the 1860s, they decided that criminals couldn't be reformed. There was no point trying to reform them, because you were born that way. So they took away all the kind of attempts to reform and just kept the really harshness. And the silent system was like the separate system, but even harsher. They had to be silent all day. They had to sleep on wooden beds. They had to eat the same boring food every single day. Now, Also linked to this is the idea of religion. Now, during the medieval time, the church played a really big role in the legal system, such as trial by ordeal, sanctuary, the church courts. By this time, the church does not have that control of the legal system. However, there is still a religious element because they used religion within the prisons to try and reform people. So religion is still being used as part of the prison system. So I will stop there.